Thanks for being here. Thanks for having accepted this invitation and for staying for the second part of this panel. My name is Santiago Gutierrez. I'm executive editor of Latin Trade, which is a business publication focused in Latin American in the Latin American region. First of all, I wanted to thank the Wilson Center, which was my home for the past semester. I wanted to thank the Vidanta Foundation and the World Bank for hosting us today. It's a pleasure and a real honor to be back to moderate this highly relevant panel. I will not present the speakers in this panel. You have, once again, you have their bios on the packet that you have on your hands. I encourage you to look at them because they are truly fantastic. I will just say that Bill Maloney is a person that not only has an impressive career as an economist, that he has authored one of the most relevant books on innovation in emerging markets in recent times, and that for us Latin Americans, we're very lucky to have had Bill living with us for a number of years. And he has struggled with our governments and with our entrepreneurs and with our societies in so many ways that I think we have to thank him, and especially on the topic of innovation. I think I'll only say a few words again about Diego Molano. Diego Molano, former Minister of ICT in Colombia. He actually made Colombia jump ahead in the neighborhood, in the realm of internet access and connectivity. And this is something that Diego doesn't know. I was speaking with a person in Miami just a few weeks ago, and this person worked with Diego when he was at the ministry. And I told him that I was going to see him, and you should see the grin on his face. I mean, this is something that was outstanding, impressive. Because, you know, when ministers become former ministers, they lose relevance. And in this case, he was so happy, and he was saying so many good things about Diego that I feel that he is at least not a forgotten minister. Good. And Luis, I'll just say that Luis he is the lucky one in this case because Luis had a post built for him. He's the advisor on innovation to the president of the IDB, and that's a rare instance in his case because he's an expert, of course, in innovation, but the post was built exactly and suited for his knowledge, and now we in Latin America are benefiting from his being there. So thank you three so very much for being here. And let's start by asking each of the panelists to give us your impression on what should public policy do to improve innovation in large Latin American firms. The thing, as Cindy was saying, is that the string that goes between innovation and productivity and growth is broken somewhere. And public policy has a role to play in fixing that channel. And let me just ask Bill if he has some initial thoughts on that.
Perfect. Thanks, Santiago, for that excessively kind introduction. It's been a pleasure to work with you over the last, I guess, almost 10 years now. I just wanted to start taking a view from 20,000 feet about how countries innovate. What are the two big barriers I see to firms of all sizes innovating? And to do that, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. The two things are basically your overall context, which gets a lot of attention in the World Bank. Those of you who lived through the Washington Consensus know all the emphasis was on get the framework conditions right and it'll all happen. The other has to do with the innovative capability of everybody, ranging from the scientists in your country to the managers in your country to the people who work in the firms. And I'll give you two quick examples from the turn of the previous century where Latin America tripped a little bit, particularly the big firms. First of all, we were the big players in mining globally. Chile was the largest exporter of copper. Mexico was the vice president of the World Mining Association, both of those in 1880. By 1900, both those businesses were broken, were dead, and they were bought out by foreigners. Why was that? Because they could not manage the new technologies coming out of Britain and the UK to process and detect copper and iron ore and silver and the like. The second is, who did the industrialization of Latin America? And it turns out that somewhere between 30 and 70 or 80% were immigrants. You have to ask yourself why these very smart guys who started these mining companies and started the large swaths of agriculture, people who got out of bed in the morning, didn't seize these opportunities, and it had to be foreigners who came to do it. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with the capability of recognizing an opportunity, the ability technically to manage and see, okay, this could work here, and then, the ability to calculate the risk profile and manage that risk across time. And that requires a set of different skills. And, are you open psychologically to new things? Do you get out a lot? Do you know how to manage a company, a sophisticated company? Do you have people who can technically help you? And the way I think this is sufficient statistic for where Latin America was at that time, if you just take the density of engineers around the world, Sweden and Denmark, who were natural resource exporters and peripheral economies at the time, had about 100 engineers per 100,000 workers. The south of the United States had about 60, and keep in mind the south was a deeply backwards place in 1900. But Latin America is all uniformly below 20, okay? They share that with Spain and Portugal, so we know who to look to for this. But the fact of the matter is that if you are that far behind the American South and the second wave of the Industrial Revolution hits you, you are not going to be able to take advantage of that new wave of technology. Now, we're in a similar place right now. No one knows, okay, is it, Bitcoin and blah, 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 whether this is going to really change everything or whether, it's going to be progress, where we're going to be constantly looking for new opportunities and implementing them. It is a worry that TFP growth in Latin America is slowing. And it's slow, it's never been really high, and it's slowing. It's a worry that seems to be matched by low R&D investment, particularly by the private sector. And that's been a long-standing thing, and it's below what you would expect for countries at their level of income. It's consistently been that way. Part of that is the composition. In general, natural resources and agriculture invest less in R&D, but nonetheless, or at least measured less, but part of it is real. And then when I see in Colombia, when we were there, how particularly the SMEs, but also large companies are being hurt by competition from East Asia, and they're not able to get strategies to deal with this, either by upgrading their products or increasing their efficiency or just devising a strategy to not compete in the direct market. You see there's an issue of innovative capacity again in this century. And part of it, again, is context. Volatility is a problem. Infrastructure is a problem. If I can't get access to a big market, why would I bother innovating? The Minister of Innovation in New Zealand once told me that her big innovation policy was to get them off the island and to train them so they can compete abroad. No scientists, no big science parks, no nothing, just get them out. So, and if you can't get through a port or something, you're not going to get out. There's also an issue of managerial capabilities, and I want to stress this because we brought it out a lot in the book Santiago kindly mentioned, The Innovation Paradox. Even the best of Latin America's entrepreneurs are substantially behind the frontier in terms of managerial capabilities. And why this is, say, why don't they fix it? A lot of it is, some of it is competition. If you don't have to compete, why improve? Yep. Part of it is just an information asymmetry. If I've been to every Latin American country at this point and presented the statistics that came out of the Stanford LSE study on management and said, look, you guys, you're at the level of Kenya. Nobody believes it, okay? And you say, okay, one country is wrong, Brazil may be wrong, maybe Colombia is wrong, maybe Chile is wrong. They can't all be wrong. Latin America generally has really low managerial capabilities and extends across the spectrum. So that's a big problem. I mean, that is a representative of this whole innovative capability I'm talking about, and it affects all sizes of firms. So to get to this 1 second on what government needs to do, because having enough engineers in 1900, that's not just every firm investing in its own engineers. You want to have an engineering capability. For instance, in Antioquia, Pedro Nello Spina came back from Berkeley, set up the Antioquia School of Mines, and part of the reason for Antioquia's great success was it had good engineers and it had good businessmen coming out of the Antioquia School of Mines, okay? If you're a government or you don't have someone inspired like Pedro Nello Spina doing that, you're not going to have that capability. Government has to be thinking in various different ways of filling the market failures that are not going to happen by the private sector, and there are a lot of them. But 3 criteria for government policy that I think we need to work on in Latin America. The first is, how good are we at identifying why we're not, for instance, having more R&D? I mean, the standard thing is say, well, Sweden subsidizes R&D, so we should. Okay, but maybe the big firms in Latin America aren't investing in R&D for a different reason. Maybe it's because they're not really thinking of an external market, or they've got a captive local market, or maybe it's just so much volatility that they can't take a long-term horizon, which is what R&D needs. We need to identify the market failure before we set up a policy. The second thing is to have some coherence in policy. It happens everywhere. It's not just Latin America. You have 2 or 3 ministries in charge of innovation policy. They don't talk to each other. In fact, they compete with each other. And they all have identical programs, and each of them has a peso and a half in it. Okay, so there's no critical mass, and frequently the business sector feels that they can't talk to them, okay? That they're not responsive to their needs because they have some other goal in mind. That coherence, we've got something called the Innovation Public Expenditure Review, what we're developing in the bank, which we did in Colombia. I think it's very useful for getting people around the table to say, okay, where are resources going? Are they really helping the private sector? Do we have enough dedicated to the right areas? And are we evaluating what we're doing on a regular basis? The final thing is consistency over time. Chinese take a long view. The Koreans take a long view. Everyone's got a horizon of 50 years. We have to be strong enough to counteract North Korea if the United States drops out. We have to be independent of China. We have to defend ourselves. We need a long-term program. Okay, it often happens in an unnamed country. First year of an administration, innovation was one of the locomotores of government policy. This was a huge thing. Year 2, it disappears. It really gets de-emphasized. And by year 3, with a 3rd minister in the planning, it's gone all entirely. That will never happen in Asia. And we have to be able to maintain a longer-term horizon in our thinking, and that means we need a consensus at a national level that really raising productivity and really improving innovation is a critical agenda. So, thanks.
Diego.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk about innovation. I think Bill, touched on the key elements. And what actually, have to start saying that in a few weeks here at the Wilson Center, we're going to publish a very, very, very interesting research that I'm leading, analyzing the entrepreneurship ecosystems in Latin America. What is happening with the startup communities in the region? And what we have found so far is that there is a lot of missing links. The first one is the innovation culture. There is no a real culture of innovation starting from the school or even from families. The typical Colombian mother, I don't want to refer to the rest of Latin America, is don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's avoiding the kids to take risks. And it goes to the school and to the university, and that happens. And it is very hard to change a culture. And I thought, when I started as a minister in 2010, that was a big challenge. And I think, I saw Colombia, and and it is amazing. In just 4 years, the culture changed dramatically. I saw that as well in Chile, with Startup Chile, with the program. Because at the beginning, there were not entrepreneurs. Or there were kind of different entrepreneurs. Not the ones that we need nowadays. Uh, and of course, to create that culture, we need to change education. And that's a big, big, big problem in the region. Education, of course, you see the PISA numbers, and they're really, really bad. The STEM ability, the STEM skills of students are very, very, very poor. We need to change that. But in the case of Colombia, just 1 out of 10 kids that were born in 1986 have finished a university degree or a post-secondary degree. Just 1 out of 10. So still the capacity of countries to educate people is very, very, very limited. And we conducted a few exercises with them, in this case again in Colombia, analyzing the skills of those people who recently graduated from elite schools. I'm not talking about the poor schools or whatever, no. High-level universities. You know, the university where Bill went in Colombia and my university, and we took doctors, lawyers, accountants, and we assessed their abilities for the new economy. Basically non-existent. So we have a very limited capacity in terms of post-secondary education, but what we are teaching them is not what the world is needing today. Big time. I'm not talking about, again, about poor public universities. I'm talking about the elite of Colombia. And that it is happening all over the region. The third element we found is that we didn't find a lot of initiatives, a lot of like a critical mass of entrepreneurs. And we took a deep look at Guadalajara, Medellin, Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo and Campinas. We found some. We found some people are starting to do that. And you see, for example, out of Argentina, we have now 5 unicorns, 5 big startups, and that's fantastic. But little by little, it is happening. But then, the question of how do they get finance is the question to be answered. There is a huge gap. I mean, people can get finance for like the seed capital from different ways, but then when the money is needed between $100,000 and $1 million, there is a huge gap. There is no money. And entrepreneurs do not need just the money. They need smart money. And that's the money that comes with knowledge, with contacts, with networks, with access to markets. And that's, so we need like more angels with knowledge or venture capital funds that are able to transmit that smart capital to the ecosystems. And we had in the previous panel, the corporations. These were good examples, but that's not the rule in Latin America. Basically, that is not happening. Corporations are not investing in the ecosystems, but they need to. They have to learn that in order to really compete in this new world, those corporations need to incorporate innovation. And incorporate innovation from startups, it is just 1/5 of the cost and 5 times faster than creating their own innovation. And so, I think we need to really encourage the corporations to create corporate venture capital funds, to invest in startups, but also to share knowledge with them. Those startups are learning a lot that could be really worth it for the corporations, and the corporations know the markets, they know the consumers, they know how to produce things. So there is a lot of things to do here. But there, when we see why is that not happening? One big thing, it has to be with what Ben said, the managers. We do not have the managers with the skills to do that. We do not have the right managers to really innovate in the way they develop business. and to interact with the startups, to take new risks. Today, the innovation is like within the house. If you see the Global Innovation Index, and I'm sure that you saw it, I mean, I participated in the two first reports. I mean, you see that the big gap of Latin America is in that ability of companies to innovate. And we have to really encourage big corporations to really join forces with the startups to do that. Of course, in terms of the government policies, they are needed. But people think that the best way to do it is just doing copy and paste of what happens in Silicon Valley. And that's the first big mistake. Copying Silicon Valley, it is a big mistake. It happened to me when I was a minister. Unfortunately, I failed big time fast, and I learned that that's completely wrong. We have our own way to innovate. We have to really create our own paths to innovation. You know, Silicon Valley has been there for almost 60 years, almost 70 years already. And we cannot really copy what is happening there. We have other models in Estonia and Israel that are a little bit more similar to our reality. But a key element here, if a government has to put energy on one thing, that thing is talent. Talent is the most critical issue. And we need 4 types of talent. The first one is, of course, the developers, engineers, as Ben mentioned, big time. And it is happening in all over the region, is that number of computer engineers is falling instead of growing. So the gap is growing. It's like in Colombia, the number of students joining computer engineering schools drops by 5% every year. Today, the gap between supply and demand of engineers in Chile is 20,000, in Panama is 5,000, in Colombia 92,000 people. So we need to close those gaps, the typical software engineers or programmers. The second type of talent we need is that every single professional, every single one should have a little bit of a computer engineer. An accountant has to understand how blockchain works. A doctor has to understand how big data works. That's critical. The third type of talent we need is women. Women, big time. If we need to increase our productivity, we have to encourage women to work in the economy. And the fourth and most demanded talent we need today is leaders. Leaders. Leaders for both the public sector and the private sector. Leaders to do that digital transformation that I was mentioning in the previous panel, but we need urgently those leaders.
Thank you, Diego. Luis.
Well, Santiago, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. From the IDB, we are really excited about this topic. And I have to say that if we're not for the leadership of the president of the IDB, Luis Alberto Moreno, I think this topic would not be so central and important in the agenda of the IDB as it is right now. So I think that it has been a privilege to work for him and to see how he really sees not only the innovation, but the whole digital economy transformation that is happening so fast as a key factor for Latin America looking forward. And he also sees the role of the bank as an agent of change. And if we don't understand fully what are the impact of that digital transformation and innovation, we're not going to be able to help the countries, be it in sectors like education, health, natural disaster, climate change. So I think that, and we'll talk more about, how innovation impacts the large private firms, and I think it's key because we do know that 85% of the R&D globally is done by private sector companies. So, I mean, if they are not doing it, we're going to be in trouble. And it's interesting if you look at some of the numbers, because if you look at a country like I'm Brazilian 200 million people, right? But look at Israel. I went to Israel recently, 8 million people. 4.5% of the GDP goes into innovation, right? The US, 3% of GDP, and the US GDP is $18 trillion. So 3% of $18 trillion is a lot of money, goes into this. Brazil, which is the largest economy in Latin America, is 1.5% of the GDP, but the average in Latin America is just 1%. Costa Rica, Mexico, and Argentina have less than 1% of their GDP invested in innovation, right? So we have a problem, right? I mean, we don't have to say, that's why we're here in this meeting. So the question is that, how do we create an environment that companies can innovate, and how governments and public sector participate actively on that? But if you understand some of the key challenges for this innovation to happen is the weak innovation climate in the region. Let's take the example again. Some of you talked about investment in companies. There is a underdeveloped capital market to support innovation in the region. So if you do not have an ecosystem of investors and capital available at interest rates that make sense for you to innovate, it's not going to happen, right? You're going to be heavily dependent of the public sector finance. So that's a key challenge that we have to face. The second one, I think the previous panel, they talked about intellectual property and patents. You know, Korea vis-a-vis Latin America, not even Korea vis-a-vis Brazil, it's Korea vis-a-vis Latin America. But in Brazil, it takes average 12 years for you to register a patent. So, and this is the most advanced country when you think about registering patent in Latin America. So here you do have a big problem, right, which is regulatory, which has to do with policy, right? But then you go to talent. We all talked about talent, and we like to exchange different numbers. I like this one. In the US, you have 22 PhDs per 100,000 inhabitants. In Latin America, you have 3.5 PhDs, right? So again, it's funny because I advised DuPont long ago, more than 10 years ago. And at DuPont, they had 80,000 employees and 5,000 PhDs, right? And I said, oh my goodness, how can that be? Probably more than the whole city of Brazil or many cities of Brazil, right? So I mean, this conversation of how do we foment and create and promote, you know, people to aim to go for higher education and pursue PhDs is absolutely key, right? And we can give examples of not having. Cisco, for example, looks at 2025 and says that 1.2 million software developers will be needed in Latin America. Of course, we do not have the software developers there, right? So this is key. But the third element is the low penetration of the Latin American companies in global value chain. Right? You had large players. You have SAP, you had McDonald's, you had big multinationals. If you're not part of the global value chain, they are highly productive, then of course you're missing the boat. You're not part of it. So it's not so much how do we open our economies, but how do we participate in global value chains. But in the global value chains, not competing by price, you have to compete by technological components, because we often participate in global value chains just by price, right? More on the lower side of that. But are we participating on the technological part of it? And we are not, right? So these are three key elements. And the answer to you is, what is the IDB doing it, right? Because the IDB works closely with the governments in the region. So we have about 31 projects in our portfolio on innovation, and we just approved a major one in Brazil, $1.5 billion, right? Big one, to support innovation of large firms through the public sector. But Brazil is a special case in a sense that it does have an agency of innovation called FINAP, which has, but if you go to Central American countries, eventually you won't find that. So the question is that Latin America is so asymmetric when you think about the companies and the countries, that marks a very challenging environment for the bank to participate and to work actively on that. I'm not going to even touch the whole digital economy conversation, which is, Diego also helped us to think through it for the IDB. But right now, what the mandate that we have from the President's office is to make sure that we push an agenda of digital transformation for the countries in the region, because he has it very clear that if we do not help the countries to actively participate in this new industrial revolution, the Latin America will come out of this as losers again. And the way to do that is to look at the digital transformation through 5 pillars. Connectivity, which is key. Only 50% of Latin America is connected to the internet. Only 27% of Latin America is connected to 4G. And if you think about the automated driverless cars and AI, this will not happen with 4G. This has to happen with 5G. We are not even in the 5G, right? So it's a key conversation about infrastructure and connectivity. Policies and regulations are very important, not only in the space of finance and technology, fintech, but the other conversation that we have to look at is content. How do we provide content to small, medium enterprise in Latin America so that they are excited to be connected to the internet and not only to do Facebook and Instagram and all the social media? How do we really take full advantage of the content? And the content generated today in Latin America is minimal. Out of the 100 sites most visited in Latin America, only 26 are from Latin America. In contrast, out of the 100 sites most visited in the US, 88 are from the US. So here too, you're transferring, other than Netflix that we all love to watch, you're transferring income in a way from Latin America outside the region because you are, and so this is a key conversation we're thinking about digital transfer. You gotta think about content, providing content for the region, from the region, right? And the two other elements, talent, that Diego always says, talent, 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 we talked about all the time. And the last one that is not less important is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is key. Why? Because you would not drive on highways with your car if you're not safe. The same thing's gonna happen. Doesn't matter that you're connected, but you all suddenly feel that it's not safe to be connected all the time and do the kind of transactions that you do. So cybersecurity is big, and cybercrime in Latin America is over $100 billion a year. It costs the region that, right? So it's significant. Only 5 out of many Latin American countries have a cybersecurity policy, in place, well designed. So this is a conversation that often is overlooked, but we have to really focus on it. Again, I'm going to stop here because this is a fascinating topic, and I'm sure there are other areas to touch, but thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I think it's a great way to start this conversation. And let me go back to Bill, posing this question. You know Philippe Aghion, the economist, and he claims that firms and countries behave differently depending on the distance from the technological frontier. So you have, for instance, competition. That's a tool, that's a policy tool, which is always, something that governments have at their hand. And Aghion says that companies and countries that are closer to a technological frontier will improve when they are faced with competition. But if you're far from the frontier, what companies do is they throw the towel, in a way. They do not raise up to the standards of major world competitors. Do you think that in Latin America, since we have large firms that might be closer to a frontier, and then we have a lot of large firms that are not close to the frontier, should we have dual policies, or is that too inconvenient and too hard to manage?
So I think both things are at play in Latin America, both ends of his inverted U. Just to go back in history for another second, one of the areas, the other one was Minas Gerais, but one of the areas in Latin America which actually did its own industrialization was Antioquia. Their immigrants did not play a particularly large role. And so they're one of Hirschman's 3 big growth pools, and they did it themselves. I think part of it is because they were really involved in London and the whole value chain of mining and everything, but they were at the frontier in certainly mining in the mid-1800s. But somehow it didn't continue over time. If you look at the number of engineers per capita in Antioquia in 1990, it just reaches the level that upstate New York had in 1880. They were both textile powerhouses, but for some reason, the Paisas didn't say, oh, okay, we really want to compete out there. They didn't. And basically, you had a captive market, right? So I think that had Coltejera and these other places had some competition much earlier, they would have said, okay, we've got an exquisite sense of design in Colombia. If we can just get our production processes up in efficiency, we're going to take over the world. Didn't happen, I think, probably because of lack of competition. On the other hand, there's a recent study we did for Chile about the impact of Chinese competition. It really squeezes the margins, okay? And we find that squeezing the margins has exactly Schumpeter's effect of having less innovation. There's less investment. So this is exactly what you would expect on the other side if you're further from the frontier, right? On the other hand, it seems to be a much greater effect if you're credit constrained, right? So maybe it's not so much that you need these big rents as an incentive to innovate, but maybe it's that because our credit markets are imperfect in Latin America, that we fund innovation out of the rents. And when you squeeze those, we can't do anything. So that leads me to think that competition, we need to increase competition. Latin America's firms are big. Industrial concentration is high by global standards, right? So we need more of that. And when you throw in things like geography and bad roads and stuff like that, competition is not so severe. But definitely if we're going to, you have to follow what the Japanese did in the 80s when the United States forced them to open the market. You pair that increased competition with support like managerial consulting services and the like, and be sure there's access to finance to make, to get over the rough times. I mean, when I talk in the auto parts sector in Colombia, there are basically three kinds of folks adjusting to the Chinese competition. One said, okay, I'm just going to compete with them by lowering my prices. It's below my costs, but that's what I'm going to do. Those people are dead. But there's another group of people who just couldn't really articulate a strategy, right? And if you help them a little bit, they say, okay, you're right. I shouldn't be trying to, go head on with the Chinese. And so like one firm switched from making brake pads that it was competing directly with Beijing. And so they went at these vertical iron gardens, right? They have to be tailor-made to every wall in Bogota. You can't do it at scale. So they found a market with some pendiente, right? But it required a little help to think through the problem because managerial skills, as we know, is weak. So I think a package, particularly for the SME sector, that combines, okay, we're not going to release the pressure to compete, but we're going to help you. We're going to help you get to the frontier. I think that's an essential part of the package.
Mm-hmm.
Diego, academia is one of your strengths, and there's an ever-present recommendation. And let me be a little bit of a devil's advocate in this. You always tend to think that you have to put together universities and firms and let the magic work. I mean, get great innovation. But for large companies, the real problem is that they have the resources to hire MIT or McKinsey. Is there any reason for changing that behavior?
I'm the president of a university in Colombia with 30,000 students for the base of the Pyramid of Colombia. And I've been the president of that board for almost 2 years. And I have been trying to do that. It is trying to have a marriage of two people that do not know each other. So we have to build trust first before you get married. So what governments try to do is really try to push them, or everybody tries to push them to do things together, but there is no trust. So we have to really go through that path of creating trust between the private sector and the universities. And the best way is to make win-win projects. And the first thing is not about investing in innovation. The first thing is about creating talent. Again, that's what we are doing. Creating talent that the companies require in the short run, the specific talent they need. And once that trust is created, that once the universities are creating the right talent, then in the next phase they are going to be investing in innovation. But there is a huge barrier in general terms in Latin America, and there is a conference today in Argentina, in Rosario, discussing this, which is the regulation of education. It is completely outdated in Latin America. So universities try to do that, but regulation kind of slows them down. Adjusting a curriculum in Colombia of a program, of an engineering program, takes 2 years. and a lot of red tape. So we also need to take a look at regulation of education.
Perfect. Luis, I think we've heard that CEOs play a crucial role on innovation in two ways. One is leadership, and the second one, which is my personal takeaway from the first panel, is that method and managerial practices are just key. I mean, the gentlemen that were sitting here before us, they showed us that they know that innovation is not, it's a job, it's not a miracle. It's something that you do and you work for it. So my question for you, Luis, is there any way that public policy can induce or force or whatever, move CEOs into being better leaders and know and apply best managerial practices?
I think the best driver for innovation is if you operate in competitive markets and open markets. So I think public policy that promotes that kind of opening markets and pushing companies to compete, I think this is a key incentive. But on top of it, we've seen, all of us through our lives, and leadership is key. I mean, those who are able to see the future and understand the relevance of its business, not only from an economic point of view, but also from transforming society. And I think we have heard here in the previous panel, I mean, the concern about your environment. And how do you bring social innovation into this conversation too? I mean, it's not only the technological conversation, right? So I think there are two elements here when I think, we have to see and reward CEOs that innovate, but I think that they also have to create within their companies recruitment tools to bring the new generation that wants to innovate. And I have a couple examples that are fascinating. People working in my teams, and they have left companies. They say because the companies that they're working for were not innovating. They do not want to work for companies that are not innovating. They do not want for companies who are not perceiving the opportunity. So it's fascinating because retaining talent, not only development talent, but retaining talent is absolutely key in this new competitive world that we're living in. And if your CEO is not perceived by the core of the company as someone thinking about the future of its own business, people just jump out of the boat because they want to be in companies who are going to be lasting, right? So creating internal incentives are important also for not only to have the top leadership, but for them to be able to enlist and to enroll a large part of the company. The second conversation is that you have to understand that innovation is messy. It's not straightforward. And this sometimes people want to innovate with very low margins. And, you got to innovate, but you got to keep doing the business as usual. Say, listen, it's not possible. Innovation is messy. So if you do not carve out the resource internally to give people the mandate to innovate and try and error, it's not going to happen, right? So there is a key element to that. And how the public sector can help and promote that, I think is really making markets a lot more competitive, because in those environments, the companies who are not innovating, they're going to be irrelevant and they're going to just miss out.
Perfect. I'm going to ask you to be very brief on the response to these questions, because I want to open to questions from the audience. Bill, most large companies in the region are family-owned. A statistic in Mexico, for instance, 90% of listed companies are family-controlled. And that happens all over Latin America, not only small companies, but big firms. And one of the major, from our research, what we have found is that one of the major breaks to innovation is that families control management, CEOs, in fact. And the problem of not having professional CEOs is what we have seen here. Is there any way that public policy can induce families to make professional choices on their management, aside from, say, opening the economy?
So super briefly, trying to understand why it is that firms don't look for professional management, for instance, to help them is is a bit of a mystery, but we have a couple hints. One is they don't know how bad they are to begin with. And no, I mean, there's Nick Bloom's data has here's my objective ranking of how good you are as a manager, and here's your self-ranking. And it should be, if everyone has rational expectations lining up nicely on the line, it's orthogonal. The worse you are as a manager, the better you think you are. So there's definitely an information asymmetry problem that governments could help. And I think this, having managerial consultants go in and benchmark you, I found entrepreneurs were very, I didn't think of that. You're right. I mean, I found entrepreneurs were very receptive to information. The second thing is that we found in a recent paper is that often they won't let go of control of a company because the legal system is not secure enough so that if Santiago starts misbehaving, I can get rid of him, right? And so I'm going to turn over control of my firm and not be sure that I can get it back for any number of reasons. And it's a very tight correlation with rule of law measures or trust measures in society. So, again, getting the playing field, one that's I'm going on too far. You want a reliable, trustworthy playing field so that people can
Thank you.
look for the best talent.
Thank you, Bill. Diego, there's something that is, I wouldn't call it a fad, but it's something that is sort of moving fast, and it's important as far as innovation comes. It's having governments give a mission to their entrepreneurs. Let's go to the moon. Let's build an atomic bomb. Do something major. Of course, there are some better missions: reducing extreme poverty, infant mortality, crime, urban mobility, that sort of thing. Do you think that having a mission is important, an important part of policy making as far as innovation goes?
I think, of course, there are many examples of things like that being done in Latin America, but they do not create ecosystems. And I think we need to do now is creating ecosystems. And I think if a government wants to promote such a thing, they rather, like, for example, deregulate some industries to create the frameworks. For example, now we need the right frameworks to grow the fintech world, the entrepreneurs in the finance world, the fintech world. So it is way better to create the right regulatory framework to let them grow, or into the agtech, the technology for agriculture, or the health tech. We need the right frameworks to get them grow. That's way better than just giving a prize. It's like many governments all over the region do a lot of hackathons. That's completely worthless. I mean, because there are some people, some entrepreneurs, specialize in just winning those types of contests. But that, once they get the prize, nothing happens. The companies die.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Diego. Luis, and I think that there's sort of an agreement on the topic that productivity comes from being contenders with world-class competition. And how do you force or convince large companies to become part of this global global market or global value chains, as you were saying?
Great. Listen, just before, I forgot something that I think is quite powerful, and we're actually using it in Brazil to promote innovation, which is public procurement. Okay. Public procurement is absolutely a key, important policy to promote innovation, and we actually have a network of Latin American public procurement agencies, and we are advancing with them. And let me just give you why it's important, an example that is important. We've been talking about cloud computing and how critical it is for countries to adopt cloud computing in order to go through the digital transformation. Governments have a hard time to buy CapEx vis-a-vis, OpEx vis-a-vis CapEx, right? So this is operational expenditures versus capital expenditure. And so if you want to transform the economy adopting cloud computing, you have to allow governments to buy operational expenditures rather than CapEx. This seems silly, but it's absolutely key to unlock a digital transformation in the region. And we have to have these conversations with the public policy. Going back to your point, I think the markets are very important. Let me give you just a quick example of SMEs. I think we talked about SMEs and how it is. We look at SMEs in Mexico. They are plugged in on the eBay internet. And these companies are, 100% of them are exporting. their products, right? I mean, really participating actively in global markets. And the companies that are not in Mexico participating into that, which is a large part of it, they are not exporting, they pay lower salaries, the retention of employees in their companies is reduced. So all kind of negative externalities, if you want, vis-a-vis those who are participating in exporting and participating in global and competitive markets. So I do think the governments have to play a key role in opening up markets and creating and facilitating for particular small and medium enterprise to be able to export, because most of them serve local markets because they believe that they cannot participate in global markets.
Perfect. I think we have time for perhaps 1-2 questions at the most. If you could please identify yourself and use the microphone if there is one, I think. Yeah, 1 and 2.
Should I go? Okay. Thank you so much. My name is Sergio Martinez, and I am with 3IE Impact, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. I have a question about the public policy dialogue in terms of innovation that is happening in the Americas, especially in regards of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the SDG number 9, which is in innovation, infrastructure, and sustainable production. So I'm wondering how the public and private sector have aligned common interests and strategic plans towards the achievement of these goals in particular, and if there is a network across Latin America that is very seriously engaging with indicators and best practices in order to generate basically sustainable solutions to address all of these prospects. And also in terms of the entrepreneurship ecosystems, I'm wondering in which areas of the entrepreneurship ecosystem, in terms of dimensions, where do you see the main gaps in terms of is there innovation network in investment networks or the culture transferable knowledge across different institutions? Thank you.
Anyone wants to respond?
Sounds like Diego.
Diego, you want to do it?
I can answer the second question, which is the gap is huge. I mean, in every aspect of the ecosystem, the gap is huge. The largest gap is talent, by far. The second gap is financing the startups, and again, that's where the corporate world plays a role, but also regulation. For example, crowdfunding regulation is key here to close that gap urgently in the region, and the creation of angels and so on and so forth. But also there is market access that I didn't mention before. That's a huge gap. If an entrepreneur tries to develop a solution for a small market, that effort is exactly the same one as for a large market. Mm-hmm. And Latin America is failing big time in unifying a market. And Luis and the IDB and many people have been trying to really unify. Helping, for example, the Pacific Alliance to really try to show them the importance of having a common digital market. And unfortunately, the steps taken in that path are very, very, very shy. Because the market size or market access is key here, and we are very, very, very limited. And every single gap is again huge, and but I think what we are seeing, today in Latin America is really positive news. Latin America is being connected big time. The connectivity is growing. There is a gap in the quality and the price, but we are advancing. We are not frozen in that front. The second issue is young people. Young people, millennials and now the Gen Z, they don't want to be employees, they want to be entrepreneurs. And that force is growing big time, and that's going to change also the numbers of entrepreneurship in the region. There are now a few unicorns. And those unicorns create, invest in other startups, and that really strengthen the ecosystems. And some universities, some people in the academia are changing. The government plays a good role, a key role, but we have to take into account that if you go today to the Silicon Valley, and you ask the entrepreneurs, what do you want from the government? They always say, no, go away, government, go away. We don't need them, And the Silicon Valley owes everything to the government. If you see what it is behind that, in terms of the money invested, public money invested in universities, in research, and it's like. But today, the layer of startups, they don't see the government as a real value. In Latin America, we want the governments to give incentives. We have now a good example. Argentina, Macri's government is clear. We have to create more entrepreneurs. We have to strengthen SMEs. And he passed this law, the entrepreneurship SMEs, giving incentives, real tax incentives to corporations that invest in startups. So things are happening, and I'm very optimistic about the future of entrepreneurship in the region.
And let me give you one good news on this context, which is there is a company in Guatemala, Duolingo. You know how many clients they have globally? 300 million. A Guatemalan company founded by a CEO in Guatemala. So this is what this digital economy is allowing and enabling, is smaller economies that you would never imagine as key players.
And a final question, perhaps. The gentleman on the blue shirt. Please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. My name is Hernan Rosenberg. I work with Development Outcome Organization. And I have a baby face, so bad news. I cannot disagree with anything that has been said. Unfortunately, and that's what the unfortunate part, you read what Dr. Prevish wrote in CEPAL, in 1950. He was complaining about the lack of productivity and the need to be innovative and whatever. So I think that is, so I don't think we are looking here for a technological silver bullet, but rather, why is it that 70 years almost later, we're still saying the same thing? And I think that it has to do partly with the last topics that have been issued, which has to do with, we tend to confuse owners with entrepreneurs, and it's not the same thing. So we have a hell of a lot of owners in Latin America, but not that many entrepreneurs, I think. When I studied engineering a million years ago, we had a whole year of teaching us how to do project evaluation, and in the last class, they told, everything sophisticated. The last class was how do people actually invest, time of recovery of capital, which is the sooner you can get your money back, you're better off because I don't trust the system. That's really what it means. So agreeing with everything has been said, but what can we do so that the owners become real entrepreneurs as opposed to, because, when you're making nice money, why should you bother to do things different? And I think that that's part of the problem. I think that we have some news that are very encouraging. The regulators are starting to do regulation. You're aware that there was a whole collusion between the paper companies in Chile, Colombia, and Peru. So, things are coming up. But those are isolated up. So how do we get the owners to really behave like entrepreneurs? Really, that's the question. Thank you.
Sure.
Bill?
This gets back to Diego's question about how do we create entrepreneurs in general. I'm a little more optimistic. People like cult. Actually, there's a whole school that talks about genetics. But the cultural thing comes up a lot too. I'm actually skeptical about that. I actually think it's about getting out, just more connectivity, getting people more and more exposed to how, this is going to sound simple, how the world works and what the opportunities are, and that will encourage you to get the tools in order to engage. And I'll just give one incomplete, imperfect data, but if you just look at the share of the population that studies in the U.S., just in postdoc, tertiary postdoc, the Asians are just off the charts. They don't speak the language. You know, it's really far away, and they're all in Silicon Valley studying. Why? Because the same reason that what's-his-name said about why he robs banks. Like, that's where the money is. Latin America's not there. It's below the trend, right? Even Vietnam, which had a lot of problems with the United States, they're way off the charts in terms of number of students in the U.S. And at one point, Andres Velasco was saying, okay, we got to get more Chileans out there, and the whole startup Chile is the same thing. We're going to bring them here. I think that's, you know, getting people just to see a different vision of how they could be, how they could make a living, how they could be is important.
And if I can, just quickly, I think there is a generation shift, big time, and I'm more optimistic because of that. Being a Brazilian and working with entrepreneurs, and my very first job on supporting the emergence of the digital economy. This is late 80s in Brazil. And you talk to the large entrepreneurs at that time and say, okay, now you have been through a special period where you were protected. Markets are going to open up and you're going to compete. They say, not really. I think we're going to close our business. Say, well, wait. We have supported you for 20 years. I mean, all of us, the society, because we get crappy computers because the good ones had, high, tariffs. And you guys are going to close down? I think today you see a completely different, more exciting, very interesting generation of entrepreneurs who really want to do the job. The second thing is that you got to understand the context of high interest rates in most of our economies and the role model. I mean, you look up your uncle and your dad and the friend's dad and say, who are the guys who succeeded in their lives? And none of us had entrepreneurs. I mean, most of the role models were owners. Or actually, the dream is, I'm going to go work for a large company. I'm going to do my MBA. I'm going to be a corporate employee. Role models play a key role when you're growing up. And so I just see that this is changing in the positive direction rather than just say, you know what, I want to be an owner. But I think that has a lot to do with the context and particularly the cost of capital for you to innovate and be an entrepreneur. Be a small, medium entrepreneur in Latin America is tough life guarantee for 30, 40 years, right? And so you look at the kids in the school and say, they are not stupid. They're looking at this and say, this is the kind of roles I can follow. And so I think this is changing, but I think you have a good point. Owners and entrepreneurs are completely different animals, right?
Thank you, Luis. I think it's nice to end on a positive note. And I want to thank you so very much for staying here, for listening to this wonderful panel. I want to thank the Wilson Center, the Vidanta Foundation, the World Bank, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. And thank you again.